Jack Johnson was a fighter in the early 1900s. He dominated his opponents each time he stepped in the ring. He was unofficially named the Negro Heavyweight Champion and wanted and rightfully deserved a chance to become the heavyweight champion of the world. He wasn't given this chance because at the time blacks weren't allowed to compete for the title and because the champion at the time, Jim Jeffries, wouldn't fight him. A few years after Jeffries retired, Johnson had an opportunity to fight for the title. He ended up winning the fight, but his win ultimately led him to the fight of his life, the Great White Hope era. During this time, Johnson wasn't just fighting his opponents in the ring, he was battling adversity outside of it. Johnson faces his moment of adversity, and really the question is, how will he handle it? Will he make the right decisions and get past it, or will his life take a different path?
Jack Johnson was born on March 31st, 1878 in Galveston, Texas. His parents Henry and Tina Johnson were former slaves. Growing up during this time, especially in the South, you would think that segregation would be a big deal. But Johnson said that it wasn't an issue. His friend group consisted of white boys, and he would play and spend the night at their houses. He said, "No one ever taught me white men were superior to me," and that's how Johnson lived his life. In his later childhood years, Johnson quit school and started working. He developed a relationship with one of his co-workers, Walter Lewis. Lewis was a big fan of boxing, and he would eventually bring Jack around the sport. Johnson said he became a boxer because of Lewis. Boxing became his passion, and he worked on his craft daily as a late teenager. His first professional debut was on November 1st, 1898 in Galveston, Texas. He knocked out his opponent, Charlie Brooks, in the second round, and this was just the start of his long and successful career. During the early years of his boxing career, Johnson was married to Mary Austin, a black woman from his hometown. The relationship had its struggles due to Johnson being a traveling fighter. He would mostly fight in logging camps in small towns during the early part of his career. The relationship came to an end due to his travels, and Mary moved back to Texas. However, during this time, Johnson was starting to make a name for himself in the boxing scene. After much success in his career, Johnson was finally given the opportunity to fight for a chance at the heavyweight title. In 1908, he was set to fight the current champion Tommy Burns in Australia. Johnson overpowers Burns and moves him with ease. He's in control of the fight. Johnson moves around the ring swiftly and makes himself hard to hit. Fast movement and exhausting his opponents was Johnson's fighting style, and it proved to be successful.
Now Johnson pours it on, lifts, rights, hooks, uppercuts. Burns is defenseless. At this very moment, the police shut off the cameras and stopped the fight.
Johnson didn't just defeat Burns, he humiliated him. Burns stood no chance, and Johnson proved himself a champion in that fight. However, when he returned to the States, people didn't treat or respect him as a champion. A piece from the East Organia newspaper written after the fight said, "Johnson has no right to claim the title World's Heavyweight Champion," and also said, "I don't think the country will make a big howl over Johnson when he returns." The people were outraged, and they wanted Johnson to fight the real champion, Jim Jeffries. Jim Jeffries was the heavyweight champion of the world. He won the title in 1899 and retired undefeated in 1905. When Johnson became the champion in 1908, the people and media were outraged that there was an African American as the champion. They begged, pleaded, and pressured Jeffries to come out of retirement and once again have the title belong to a white man. Jeffries worked as a farmer after he retired from boxing. He was 35 years old and 5 years retired. He eventually agreed to the fight, but he was more than 100 pounds overweight, but that didn't matter. He was determined to prove that the white men were better than the blacks. Jim Jeffries was nicknamed the Great White Hope. The fight between Johnson and Jeffries was the biggest event at the time. The prize money was $101,000, 60% to the winner and 40% to the loser. The fight was scheduled for July 4th, 1910, and for the first time in history, a stadium was being built for a single contest. And it was also the first time in history a round-by-round account was relayed across the country by telegraph. Thousands of people came from across the country to watch the biggest sporting event to date. The event was sold out, but still thousands gathered in the street outside the stadium in hopes of seeing their champion defeat Johnson. Throughout the fight, Johnson looks poised and confident, but Jeffries fights back. In the 15th round of the fight, something happens that stops time in the country.
A vicious uppercut and 3 stinging lefts. Jeffries goes down.
The Great White Hope goes down. The crowd is stunned. Jeffries stumbles to his feet, and then Johnson knocks him through the ropes. Jeffries is helped up, but this time Johnson goes in to finish him off. The crowd holds their breath in disbelief. Their champion has fallen. On the morning of July 5th, rage swept through the country. Jeffries' defeat caused race riots, and many white people felt humiliated by the defeat of Jeffries. The riots caused at least 20 deaths and over 100 people were injured. However, the black people were filled with joy and celebrated Johnson's victory. They felt like Johnson's victory was a victory for racial advancement. Johnson goes on to defend his title against Jim Flynn, another white hope, on July 4th, 1912. He wins the fight after Flynn gets disqualified for illegal headbutting. Johnson then returns to Chicago to find his wife, Etta Johnson, a white woman who he married in January of 1911, depressed. She commits suicide on the morning of September 11th, 1912, and this is the beginning of Johnson's downfall. Rumor has it that Johnson's cafe was used for private debaucheries with white women. This outraged many white people and actions were taken against Johnson. He was arrested for violating the Mann Act. He spent 4 days in jail and then was released on bail. Johnson went to trial accused of crossing state lines for prostitution, debauchery, and unnatural acts. Johnson was found guilty by an all-white jury and was sentenced to a $1,000 fine and a year and a day in jail. Instead of going to jail, Johnson flees the country and heads to France. He had a couple of fights during his time in exile, winning them all, but the biggest fight came on April 15, 1915, where he once again defended his title. He was set to fight Jess Willard in a 45-round bout in Havana, Cuba. Johnson is fighting hard, but Willard doesn't bend, and in the 26th round, on a hot summer day in Cuba, Johnson goes down. Johnson lays flat on the canvas, and the crowd erupts in joy that the great white hope had finally arrived. Johnson doesn't lay there in defeat. He lays there exhausted, tired of running, tired of fighting for his respect, and tired of fighting for his freedom. Johnson was one of the most successful boxers, but he didn't get the respect he deserved because he was a black man. On July 20th, 1920, Johnson returns to the States and turns himself in. He spends his year and a day in jail at Fort Leavenworth. He was released from jail at age 43 and returns to Harlem. A huge parade is held in the streets for his return. It was a truly special moment because he had never gotten all this love and respect during his time as a champion.
Jack Johnson did a lot of great things in the ring. He was the first black heavyweight champion of the world, but it's not so much what he did in the ring that was great. He was a spark that lighted the fire for the progression of African Americans. He instilled hope in the souls of many across the country. He paved the way for many black athletes to follow. In the 30s, another boxing great, Joe Louis, became the second black heavyweight champion of the world. And then Jackie Robinson burst onto the baseball scene, and many more to follow. Many years later, Johnson was finally recognized as the greatest heavyweight of all time, and in 1993, he was inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame.